Chinese electric vehicles are selling more around the world, but here in the United States, the market is going in reverse. Tesla sales dropped and automakers are rethinking their EV strategies. To talk more about that, we welcome journalist Mike Colias. He is automobile industry editor for Reuters and author of the book Inevitable: Inside the Messy, Unstoppable Transition to Electric Vehicles. Mike, great to have you with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
As I said, there is currently a global shift towards electric vehicles, but here in the United States, there's not much enthusiasm. In fact, one could say that here it's been a case of one step forward, two steps back. I mean, the government has ended EV tax credits, and if you look at automakers, they're focusing more now on hybrid vehicles as well as more fuel-efficient gas vehicles. So given these conditions, do you still think there is a future for electric vehicles in the United States? Is it, as the title of your book suggests, inevitable?
Yeah, well, that title's tougher to see in the U.S. at least right now. We could talk about the rest of the world where it's a much different story, as you alluded to. But you know, I'm hearing a few people call it the EV winter here in the U.S. If you think back 5 or 6 years, there was all this buzz around electric cars. Every car company was lining up to spend tens of billions of dollars on the transition. And, you know, I'd say starting around 2023, it started to become clear that they weren't going to get as many people as they expected to buy electric cars. I think there's just still, when you get to that mainstream consumer, too much anxiety around, you know, or am I going to find a place to charge it? You're also, generally, these are higher price cars, and you're asking people to adopt a technology they're not familiar with and pay a higher price. It's, you know, it can be a tough sell. And so, you know, now about a year from ago, we had the Trump administration come in, and that's pretty much upended any momentum that the market still had for EVs. You referenced the $7,500 tax credit. It goes beyond that. There's new rules around fuel economy standards, emission standards. Those have been completely rolled back to the point where it's, you know, you've got the car companies just don't really have a big incentive to put out more EVs here in the U.S. market, and we're down to about a 5 to 6% of the sales are now EVs. We were at 10% before that tax credit went away. Europe's at 25%, China's at 50%. So yeah, right now it looks like a tough sledding for the U.S. EV transition.
Right, Mike, and that point you make about, you know, prospective buyers of electric vehicles experiencing some kind of anxiety about whether they'd have enough power to get to their destination and things like that, that is going to require massive investment on the part of state governments, even the federal government, in infrastructure, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a big ingredient for how China has you know, leaped to the front of the pack on EVs and is now dominant. The dominant player in electric cars. I mean, at last I checked, there was something like 25 times the number of fast chargers in China that there is in the U.S. A lot of money had been earmarked for chargers in the U.S. during in the infrastructure bill from a few years ago. The Trump administration has tried to hold up a lot of that funding. I think the latest is the courts are now ordering the administration to release those funds. So that should help in the coming years. But it is a real problem. I mean, if you own an EV, you're likely to charge at home, which can be just fine. You know, if most people put a charger in the garage, they're good to go for the day. You know, and these are more affluent people who have a second or third car that they can take out of town, so they don't have to worry about the road trip. But in general, you know, people who live in apartments, other multifamily homes, if you have to go on a road trip, it can still be really challenging to find a charger and find one that works because reliability is an issue. So yeah, the infrastructure is a huge piece of the puzzle here.
And talking about, you know, the change of focus on the part of automakers, I mean, if we look at Tesla, for instance, look, it's dominated sales here in the United States and in Europe as well, with models like the 3 and the Y. They've been bestsellers on both sides of the Atlantic. But now the company has decided to end production of the S and the X, and it has not announced a replacement for that. Instead, Tesla CEO Elon Musk says the focus is going to be on robots and on artificial intelligence. What do you think is behind that?
You know, I think what you're seeing there is Tesla realizes that, you know, the stock market valuation of Tesla is something like 10 times more than the top 6 or 8 automakers in the world combined, right? I mean, it's a huge valuation. Investors aren't invested in that company because it's a car company. I think Tesla knows that, and so that's why they're shifting the story and the strategy toward robo-taxis and, humanoid robots. If you're the rest of the pack, you're still a car company. If you don't have those ambitions, you've got to make this work. And now it's just trying to find the right balance between, okay, how many straight internal combustion vehicles are we going to sell versus hybrids, which are going to be a big part of this story, as you referenced earlier. I think it's still going to be decades of that sort of bridge if we ever do get to mostly or fully electric. So the car companies have to kind of calibrate their strategies now, and I think what you're seeing from Tesla is they're narrowing what was already a narrow vehicle lineup. They only had, about 4 models. They just cut that in half. It's really the Y and the 3 now. Mm-hmm. They're still going to sell well because they're the dominant player in EVs, and you're seeing all these competitors pull back some. But Tesla's kind of moving on from being a car company, I think, is the bottom line.
Now, in your book, you showed how hard it is to master the efficiency, the engineering of these EVs. In fact, when the makers of the Mustang, Ford, dismantled the Model 3, they realized how elegant and efficiently that was put together. I mean, how difficult is it for legacy automakers to adapt to this new technology?
I think it's proven very difficult, and you might wonder why that is. It still has a dashboard and axles and 4 doors, and isn't it just a different powertrain? And that's true. But when you get into the supply chain involved with what needs to go into a battery and the minerals and the refining of those minerals, and it's a completely different supply chain. And I think the companies that have had success with this, Tesla being probably the most notable, but many Chinese brands now, Rivian here in the U.S., they started from scratch, and I think that was a big advantage. I think what you've seen largely from the traditional car companies is they tried to start with their internal combustion products and kind of turn them into electrics. That hasn't worked very well. I think a lot of them now are trying that clean sheet approach, but it's been difficult, and they've stumbled out of the gate. And now that they're kind of figuring things out, now you've got this market cool down. You've got the regulatory environment working against you in the U.S. So not the best timing. So I do think that they've struggled at the start of this transition. I think they're starting to figure it out. We'll just see where the demand goes from here.
Right, and looking at supply chains, the Chinese have a distinct advantage, don't they? Because if we look, let's take a company like BYD, for instance. They are one of the biggest manufacturers and exporters in the world right now. I mean, they control the entire process from the mining of lithium to assembling battery packs. Can American companies catch up with that?
I think the short answer is no, not anytime soon. I mean, you can only do that in China, where they have, if most of those raw materials are mined there. If they're not mined there, they're certainly processed there. I think something like 80+% of the key ingredients for batteries, nickel, lithium, cobalt, manganese, all that stuff is primarily refined in China. They've got a number of other advantages too, just the broader automotive supply base there. There has been a lot of government help and support and consistent support along the way to sort of this EV dominant. So I think the estimate is they have a 30 to 35% cost advantage over the rest of the world on putting together an EV, and you're not gonna close that gap in a year or two. It's going to take a long time, I think, for the rest of the industry to catch up to their cost advantage.
All right, and somehow here in the United States, the whole transition process from gas-driven vehicles to electric vehicles has become politicized in many ways. We hear President Trump talk about the fact that he believes, for instance, that climate change is a hoax. The other challenge is that Chinese cars are not sold here in the United States because of that 100% tariff on them, but they are being sold in Mexico, and they will soon be imported by Canada as well. And you hear many analysts say, look, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when they would come to the United States. What's your view on that?
Well, it's not just analysts too. You hear some auto executives talk about that as well. I think most of them would say, if in a private moment, that they don't expect to have to face Chinese competition on American soil anytime soon in the next few years, but they believe long term it's coming. I think they take the experience that that Detroit went through in the 70s and 80s when we saw Japanese and other Asian automakers come into the U.S. and take a lot of market share away from the traditional players. So I think there's some scars from that, and I think that the industry, this is one of the biggest questions in the industry. We've seen the Chinese move into many other markets, including Europe and Latin America, and the global companies are facing that competition there. Everyone's wondering and waiting to see if there's some backdoor into the U.S., either through China, Canada, or maybe the U.S. just rolls out the red carpet. I mean, President Trump has said more than once that if a Chinese automaker wants to come in and build a factory, that he would welcome them because it would bring jobs and investment. So we'll see how all that plays out. There's certainly bipartisan, bipartisan criticism of the Chinese regime, and I think you'd have a lot of resistance to that. But the industry's preparing for it, I think, and worried about the prospect.
There are other challenges as well in the United States. I mean, if we look at the traditional auto business in the United States, I mean, you have dealerships which sell these cars, but they make most of their money from maintaining these cars, having these cars come back for services and things like that. You don't get much of that with an electric vehicle. It doesn't require much in terms of servicing. And in many instances, these dealerships are owned by private companies. They're not owned by the automakers themselves. So, and of course, you've got a company like Tesla, which actually sells its car online. So how big a change is that going to mean?
Yeah, I mean, it could be hugely disruptive for the retail dealership network here in the U.S., something like 17,000, 18,000 dealerships. I think that dealers have been hot and cold on EVs. You know, when there was all that enthusiasm for new electric models rolling out in the early part of this decade, you had a lot of dealers who were on board. Yes, they probably stand to make less on service and maintenance over time with electric cars because you don't need oil changes and other things that go wrong with internal combustion cars. But when things do go wrong, I think some data has shown that it is expensive to fix them. So it's not like their service revenue goes away. I think dealers ultimately are going to get behind whatever the consumers want. And now that we've seen the demand, ease for EVs, they're kind of off the electric car thing. And I think if a couple of years from now, if something were to happen where they get hot again, I think dealers would be on board.
Mike Colias, thanks for joining us, sir.
Thank you for having me.